I was a serf in the chapter's fortress monastery when the Venerable One first called me by another name. That was 17 years ago now, measured by the standard cycles of the orbital station where they've kept me since the incident, since the examination, since they realized what had happened and decided I was too contaminated by proximity to simply execute, but too potentially valuable to discard outright. The inquisitorial observers wanted to know everything about the months I spent in the Venerable One's presence. Every word the ancient warrior spoke to me through the vox grills of his sarcophagus, every prayer I heard him mutter in the depths of his dreams, when I cleaned the sacred oils from his armor plating in the hour before dawn. They wanted to understand how a Dreadnought's memory could fracture so completely, how 10,000 years of service could compress and distort until past and present became indistinguishable, until a chapter serf became confused with a battle brother dead for 6 millennia. My name was Merrick. Is Merrick. I have to remind myself of that constantly now, have to repeat it like a catechism against the weight of another identity that wants to settle over me like a burial shroud. The Venerable One called me Hadrian, Brother Hadrian. He spoke to me with the easy familiarity of warriors who had fought together through the breaking of worlds, who had stood shoulder to shoulder in the defense of the Emperor's realm when the stars themselves seemed poised to fall. The first time it happened, I thought perhaps I had misheard through the distortion of the Vox system. We were in the Reclusium, the vast hall where the chapter's dreadnoughts stood in their alcoves between deployments, towering figures of ceramite and adamantium that seemed to watch you even when their sensory systems were powered down to minimal function. I had been assigned to the Venerable One's maintenance detail for 3 months by then, considered reliable enough to be trusted with the sacred duty of preserving the walking tomb of a hero who had served since the chapter's founding. The air in the Reclusium always smelled of incense and machine oil, a combination so pervasive it coated your throat and lungs until you tasted it in your sleep. The walls rose into darkness above, ribbed like the interior of some vast beast, lined with alcoves, where the dreadnoughts stood, or where empty spaces waited for heroes yet to be interred. Gothic arches stretched overhead, carved with battle honors and litanies of faith, and servo skulls drifted through the upper reaches, trailing parchment prayers behind them like grave shrouds. The floor was polished stone, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, marked at intervals with the chapter's symbol inlaid in brass that gleamed dully in the light of wall-mounted lumens. It was cold there, always cold, as if the chill of the void had seeped through the fortress monastery's meters-thick walls and settled into the stones like an uninvited guest. I had been cleaning the Venerable One's lower chassis assembly, working carefully around the massive feet and the hydraulic systems that drove them, when the Vox grill crackled to life. The sound made me flinch. I had thought him dormant, his consciousness retreating into whatever dreams sustained the ancient warriors between battles. His voice emerged from the speakers with a quality like grinding stone, layered with distortion from systems that had endured millennia of punishment, that had been repaired and rebuilt so many times. The original components were long since replaced with approximations and improvements. "Hadrian," he said, "you need not be so cautious with the cleaning rites. The armor has endured worse than your ministrations." I froze with the blessed oil still slick on my hands, the cleaning cloth pressed against the joint assembly of his right ankle. The servitors working nearby continued their tasks with mechanical indifference, but I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine like cold fingers. I assumed he was speaking of someone else, perhaps remembering a brother who had tended him in earlier centuries, the name surfacing from the depths of memories that stretched back before the current Imperium existed in its present form. "Venerable One," I said carefully, keeping my eyes lowered in proper deference. "I am Merrick, your assigned serf for this cycle." There was silence for a moment, punctuated only by the distant hum of the fortress monastery's systems and the soft whir of servitor motors. Then he spoke again, and there was something in his tone, not confusion exactly, but a kind of gentle insistence, the way one might correct a child who has misremembered something obvious. "I know your name, Hadrian. We have fought together since the compliance of Goral. Do you truly think I could forget the brother who stood with me when the elder things came from beneath the surface, when we held the line though half our company had fallen? A pause, and then something that might have been concern. Are you testing me? Has the chapter master ordered some evaluation of my faculties? My mouth went dry. I looked up at the massive form towering above me, at the sarcophagus embedded in the center of the armored chassis where the Venerable One's shattered body rested in amniotic suspension, kept alive by technologies that were half understood, even by the chapter's tech marines. The front of the sarcophagus bore the chapter's symbol carved into blessed ceramite, and beneath it a name in High Gothic, Venerable Brother Tarsus. The letters were worn smooth by age, recarved and regilded a dozen times over the millennia, but still readable. I had memorized them during my first week of service, along with the abbreviated history of his deeds that had been included in my training materials. Venerable One, I tried again. I am not a battle brother. I am chapter serf, born to service, assigned to your maintenance detail by Hadrian. His voice carried a note of what might have been affection, had it emerged from anything remotely human rather than from speakers that had announced death to the Emperor's enemies across 100 worlds. Always so formal when we are alone. The crusade is done, brother. The world is compliant. We may speak freely. I should have reported it immediately. That was protocol, drilled into every serf from childhood. Any irregularity in a Dreadnought's behavior or speech was to be reported to the tech marines at once, for the machine spirits that sustained these ancient warriors were temperamental and prone to malfunction after millennia of service. But I was young then, barely 20 standard years, and I had been taught that to question or contradict a space marine was itself a kind of heresy. The chapter's warriors were the Emperor's chosen, elevated beyond humanity, their words carrying the weight of divine authority. Who was I to insist that one of them was mistaken? So I simply continued my work, murmuring non-committal responses when he spoke, pretending that perhaps this was some test of my devotion or my ability to adapt to the eccentricities of ancient heroes. The Venerable One seemed satisfied with this, lapsing into silence as I completed the cleaning rites and performed the ritual anointing of his armor joints. When I finished, he spoke a benediction in a language I didn't recognize. Syllables that seemed to predate Gothic itself, words that made the air feel heavier somehow. Over the following days, the pattern continued. When I arrived for my duties, the Venerable One would greet me as Hadrian, would speak of battles I had never fought, and worlds I had never seen, would reference shared experiences that existed only in his fragmenting memory. At first I tried to correct him gently, but his insistence only grew stronger, his voice taking on a quality of hurt confusion when I claimed not to remember the things he described. Eventually I stopped arguing. I would arrive, perform my duties while he recounted campaigns from the chapter's early history, and depart in silence. The other serfs on my shift said nothing. We had all learned that the Venerable Ones sometimes spoke strangely, their minds stretched across centuries of trauma and isolation. It was not our place to question. But then he began requesting my presence outside of scheduled maintenance periods. A tech marine would find me in the serf quarters and inform me that the Venerable One was asking for me, that I was to report to the Reclusium immediately. I would arrive to find him standing active in his alcove, the green glow of his optical sensors tracking me as I approached. And he would want to talk, not about maintenance or rituals, but about things that Brother Hadrian would remember. He spoke of a fortress monastery that no longer existed, destroyed in some catastrophic siege before the current structure was built. He described training exercises in geographies that had been scoured clean millennia ago. He talked about brothers whose names appeared in the chapter's oldest records, legends who had died before the current High Lords of Terror were even born, and I began to play along. Emperor, forgive me, but I did. Because when I responded as if I remembered these things, when I asked questions about details or expressed interest in his stories, something in his voice eased. The grinding distortion seemed to smooth slightly, the mechanical harshness giving way to something that sounded almost peaceful. He would tell me about campaigns with an enthusiasm that suggested he was reliving his finest moments, not recognizing that he was speaking to someone who could not possibly have shared them. And I found myself learning the details, memorizing the names and places and events, building a false history in my mind so that I could respond appropriately when he spoke. It was a kind of theft, I suppose. I was stealing the identity of a dead hero, wearing his name like a costume to comfort a consciousness that could no longer properly distinguish past from present. But it seemed a harmless deception, a small mercy to offer to a warrior who had given everything in service to the Emperor. What harm could it do to let him believe his old battle brother still stood beside him, that the brotherhood he remembered still existed somewhere beyond the prison of his armored tomb? The fortress monastery at night was a place of echoing vastness, where sounds carried for kilometers through empty halls and corridors that had been carved from living rock. My quarters were in the surf warrens, deep in the lower levels, where the walls wept condensation, and the lighting was perpetual twilight, from flickering lumens that were replaced only when they failed completely. We slept in cells barely large enough for a thin mattress and a small storage locker, separated by walls so thin you could hear your neighbors breathing. The air tasted of recycled moisture and the industrial detergents we used to clean the chapter's holy spaces, a chemical sharpness that never quite left your sinuses. I would lie awake some nights, listening to the distant sounds of the fortress monastery settling and creaking, and think about the venerable one standing in his alcove in the reclusium. Did he sleep? Could a mind trapped in such a state even truly rest? Or did consciousness continue unbroken across the decades, aware but isolated, experiencing time as an endless present tense, with memory becoming increasingly unreliable? The thought terrified me in ways I couldn't articulate. To exist for so long, to have served for millennia, only to have your own past become a fragmentary confusion of images and impressions that your mind could no longer properly sequence or identify. It seemed a fate worse than simple death. 3 months passed, then 4. The Venerable One's requests for my presence became more frequent. Sometimes I would be summoned multiple times in a single-day cycle, pulled from other duties to attend him in the reclusium. The tech marines seemed unconcerned. As long as his weapon systems and locomotive functions remained operational, they cared little for the eccentricities of his speech or memory. One of them told me that dreadnoughts sometimes formed attachments to particular serfs, that it was not unusual for ancient warriors to seek familiar faces in an Imperium that had changed beyond recognition around them. He spoke of it as something benign, even touching the last remnants of humanity clinging to the wreckage of warriors who had been more machine than man for longer than most civilizations endured. But I was beginning to notice changes in how the Venerable One spoke to me. His questions became more specific, more demanding of detailed responses. He would ask me about events from Brother Hadrian's life and grow agitated if my answers were vague or non-committal. I had started inventing details, creating a false biography piece by piece, trying to maintain consistency across the fabrications. I described battles I had never fought, channeling the style and language from the chapter's historical texts, hoping my improvisation sounded authentic enough. When I got something right, when some detail I invented happened to align with his actual memories, his voice would brighten with what sounded almost like joy, the mechanical grinding softening into something that might have been warmth. "You do remember," he would say. "For a moment I feared the centuries had stolen that from you as well. But you remember the defense of the tertiary gate, when we held against the corrupted for 3 days without rest. You remember?" And I would agree, my lies becoming more elaborate, more confident. I was building a prison for myself, though I didn't recognize it then. Each false memory I confirmed, each fictional detail I added to the persona of Brother Hadrian, was another bar in a cage that was slowly forming around my own identity. But the Venerable One seemed so grateful, so relieved to find that his memories were not entirely false, that someone else could confirm the events he recalled from the depths of his millennia-long existence. How could I deny him that comfort? Then came the day when he asked me to help him with something beyond our usual interactions. The request came through a tech marine, delivered with a terseness that suggested he found the task beneath him but necessary. I was to report to the Reclusium during the night cycle, when the other dreadnoughts would be powered down completely and the tech marines off duty. The Venerable One had specifically requested privacy, claiming he needed to discuss matters of a personal nature that were not appropriate for general audience. I should have refused, should have reported the irregularity immediately. But I had been successfully deceiving him for months by that point, had become comfortable in my stolen identity, and I was curious about what an ancient warrior might consider too private to discuss in the presence of his chapter brothers. So when the shift bells marked the transition to night cycle, when the fortress monastery's lighting dimmed to simulate the circadian rhythms that the space marines themselves no longer required, I made my way through the empty corridors to the Reclusium alone. The vast hall was darker than I had ever seen it, lit only by the emergency lumens that cast pools of dim red light at intervals along the walls. The dreadnoughts in their alcoves were massive shadows, their armored forms almost invisible against the darkness of the carved stone. My footsteps echoed absurdly loud in the silence, each impact of my boots against the polished floor seeming to carry for kilometers. The incense burners had been allowed to burn low, and the air was clearer than usual but colder, as if the warmth generated by hundreds of visiting petitioners and working servitors had finally dissipated into the stone. The Venerable One stood in his alcove, with his optical sensors active, twin points of green luminescence that tracked my approach. When I drew close enough, his vox grill crackled to life, the sound making me jump despite having heard it hundreds of times. Hadrian. His voice was different, somehow quieter, more intimate, as if the volume had been reduced to create an impression of privacy despite the mechanical nature of his speech. Thank you for coming. I know the hour is irregular. Of course, Venerable One. The words came automatically now, the response I had learned to give when he used that name. How may I serve? There was a long pause. I could hear the soft whir of his internal systems, the circulation of coolant and amniotic fluids, the whisper of servo motors making micro-adjustments to his posture. Then he spoke again, and there was something in his tone I had never heard before, a kind of hesitation, almost vulnerability. I need you to help me remember something correctly. The tech marines have accessed my memory engrams for review, and they found discrepancies. Events I recall that have no record in the chapter archives. Brothers whose names appear in my recollection but not in the rolls of the fallen. Another pause. They suggest my memory systems may be degrading, that the weight of centuries is creating false impressions, mixing fiction with fact. But I know what I remember, Hadrian. I know you were there. You can confirm it. My mouth went dry. This was it, the moment when my deception would either be exposed or would have to deepen beyond any possibility of retreat. I could confess now, throw myself on the mercy of the Venerable One and the chapter, admit that I had been lying for months, playing along with his confusion rather than reporting it as required. Or I could continue, could become even more entangled in this fiction, could help him defend his failing memories against those who sought to correct them. What do you need me to confirm? I heard myself ask, my voice barely above a whisper. The siege of Varanthos Prime. The tech marines say no such world appears in our campaign records from that era. They claim I must be conflating events from different battles, that the memories have become tangled over the millennia. But you were there, Hadrian. You remember the walls, the defenders in their corrupted armor, the way the sky burned with phosphorescent fire for 3 weeks before we broke their final position. Tell me you remember. Tell me I have not invented this from fragments and confusion. I wanted to run. Wanted to tear off the identity I had stolen and confess everything. Consequences be damned. But when I looked up at the massive form of the Dreadnought towering above me, at the sarcophagus where the Venerable One's broken body floated in chemical suspension, I thought about what it must be like to exist in that state, to have your every memory questioned, your very sense of self called into doubt by those who claimed to serve you but who had not witnessed the events you recalled. To be told that millennia of service and sacrifice might be degrading into fiction, that your own mind was becoming unreliable, that you could not trust the memories that were all you had left of a life that had been stolen piece by piece across centuries of warfare. I remember Varanthos Prime, I said, the lie sliding from my mouth with practiced ease. The walls were crystal, weren't they? They refracted the weapon's fire into patterns that burned your eyes even through helmet visors. And the defenders, they had been changed by something. Their armor fused to their flesh, screaming without sound through vox grills that had become their mouths. It was all fabrication, drawn from fragments of other campaigns I had read about in the chapter archives, combined with imagination and the tropes I had learned from months of listening to his stories. But the Venerable One's response was immediate and intense. Yes. His voice carried an edge of desperate relief. Yes, exactly that. The crystal walls, the refracted light. Do you remember Brother Kellyan? He was blinded in the assault. The light burning through his helm's optical systems. We carried him from the walls, and he kept saying he could still see the patterns, that they had burned themselves into his vision permanently. I remember, I lied, committing myself fully now to the deception. He served for decades after, didn't he? Claimed the visions helped him predict enemy movements. Centuries, the Venerable One corrected, but his tone was warm, grateful. He served for centuries before falling on Kaldros. But yes, exactly that. Hadrian, you have no idea. His voice actually broke, a surge of static cutting through the words. The Tech Marines were going to recommend I be placed in stasis, my memory engrams archived, and my consciousness suspended until they could be properly analyzed and corrected. They were going to take me off active duty, because they believed my recollections were too unreliable to trust in combat. But if you can confirm these things, if another witness exists to verify the events I recall, then perhaps. He stopped abruptly. I heard the whir of his sensors adjusting, focusing, and suddenly understood with horrible clarity what I had done. I had not just been offering comfort to a confused ancient warrior, I had been confirming false memories, helping him construct a defense against those who sought to address his deteriorating condition. And he was going to use my testimony to argue against being removed from service, to insist that his memories were accurate despite all evidence to the contrary. Venerable One, I started, but he interrupted me. Will you testify to this, Hadrian? When the Tech Marines convene their examination, will you stand before them and confirm what we both know to be true? Will you be my witness? I should have said no. Should have confessed everything in that moment, should have thrown myself at his feet and begged forgiveness for the deception I had perpetuated. But he was asking with such desperate hope, such need to have his existence validated, to not be cast aside as broken and unreliable after millennia of faithful service. And I was afraid, terrified of what would happen when the truth emerged, of the punishment that would certainly follow, of the shame that would attach not just to me but to my entire family line of serfs who had served the chapter for generations. I will testify, I said, sealing both our fates with those 3 words. The examination took place a week later in the chapter's Hall of Records, a vast chamber lined with data stacks and parchment scrolls that contained the accumulated history of the Brotherhood since its founding. The Tech Marines were there, 3 of them in their red-marked armor, along with 2 librarians whose psychic abilities allowed them to scan for truth and deception, and a chaplain whose presence suggested this had become a matter of chapter discipline rather than simple technical review. They stood in a semicircle before the Venerable One, who had been positioned in the center of the hall with me standing beside him, small and mortal and utterly out of place, among the towering warriors of the Adeptus Astartes. The air smelled of old paper and ozone, the environmental systems struggling to manage the heat generated by so many armored warriors in an enclosed space. The walls rose into darkness overhead, lined with alcoves containing the chapter's most sacred texts, some written in High Gothic, others in languages that predated the current Imperium. Servo skulls drifted among the stacks, their mechanical sensors occasionally pausing to observe the proceedings before continuing their endless cataloging duties. The senior Tech Marine, a warrior whose name I never learned, addressed the Venerable One with a formality that was somehow more unsettling than open hostility. "Venerable Brother Tarsus, we have reviewed your memory engrams across the past 300 cycles. We have identified 73 distinct discrepancies between your recollections and the chapter's historical records. These include battles at locations that do not appear in our campaign archives, brothers whose names exist nowhere in our rolls, and events that contradict established chronologies. We believe these irregularities indicate degradation of your memory systems requiring immediate intervention and possible extended stasis." The Venerable One's response was immediate, his vox-amplified voice rolling through the chamber like thunder. "My memories are accurate. I have fought in the Emperor's name for 10,000 years. I have served this chapter since its founding. If your archives do not contain record of my campaigns, then the fault lies with the archives, not with my recollection. And I have a witness who can confirm the accuracy of my memories, Brother Hadrian, who fought beside me through the campaigns you claim never occurred." All eyes turned to me. The librarian's gaze felt like physical weight, a pressure against my mind that made my vision blur at the edges. I could feel them pushing at my thoughts, searching for deception, for the truth beneath whatever words I might speak. And in that moment, I experienced the most profound terror of my life, not fear of death, which would have been mercy, but fear of what they would find when they truly looked inside my mind. Fear that they would see not just the lies I had told, but the way I had begun to believe them myself. The way Brother Hadrian's fictional identity had started to overlay my own like a second skin. "Speak, serf," the chaplain commanded. His voice carried the absolute authority of one who serves as the keeper of the chapter's spiritual discipline. "Tell us what you remember of Varanthos Prime." I opened my mouth to confess, to throw myself on their mercy, and beg forgiveness. But the words that emerged were not confession but elaboration, detailed description of a battle I had never witnessed on a world that might not exist. I described the crystal walls and the corrupted defenders, the way Brother Kellyan had been blinded by refracted weapons fire, the weeks of siege warfare that had ended in bitter victory. The lies flowed from me with terrible fluency, and I watched the Tech Marine's expressions shift from skepticism to confusion as I provided detail after specific detail, creating a history that felt real even as I invented it. One of the librarians held up a hand, and I fell silent. He turned to the senior Tech Marine with an expression I couldn't read. His belief in the events he describes is genuine. I detect no conscious deception, no awareness that the memories he recounts are false. Either he truly experienced these things, or he paused, his psychic gaze returning to me with uncomfortable intensity, or something has happened to create authentic-seeming recollections where none should exist. The examination continued for hours. They questioned me about other campaigns the Venerable One had described, asking for increasingly specific details about events and people I had never truly encountered, and somehow I provided them, drawing on months of accumulated deceptions and the false history I had built to maintain the charade. The librarian's scans showed genuine belief in what I described, because by that point I had rehearsed these lies so thoroughly that they had begun to feel like actual memories, my imagination filling in sensory details and emotional responses until the fabrications became indistinguishable from real experience. Finally, as the shift bells marked the transition to evening cycle, the senior Tech Marine called a halt to the proceedings. He consulted with the librarians and chaplain in low voices, while the Venerable One and I waited in tense silence. When they turned back to us, the Tech Marine's expression suggested he had arrived at some decision, though whether it was the one we hoped for remained unclear. "The testimony is compelling," he admitted slowly, "and the psychic scans confirm genuine belief in the events described. However, the absence of corroborating records remains troubling. We cannot simply ignore the discrepancies between the Venerable One's recollections and our archive." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "We will defer the recommendation for extended stasis, pending further investigation. But the Venerable One is to remain in the reclusium under observation, with no deployment authorizations until this matter is resolved. And you, his gaze fixed on me like a targeting laser. You are to report to the librarium for detailed examination. Something about your memories requires deeper investigation. That was when my life ended, though I continued breathing for months afterward. The librarians took me that same night, escorting me from the Hall of Records to the chapter's librarium, a place I had only glimpsed from a distance during my years of service. The halls there were different from the rest of the fortress monastery, quieter somehow, the air heavier, as if the psychic weight of the librarian's studies had literally changed the atmosphere. They placed me in a small cell carved from black stone, featureless except for a sleeping pallet and a waste disposal unit, and left me there while they prepared their examination procedures. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't have, even if I had tried. I kept thinking about what they would find when they truly dug into my mind, when they pushed past the surface impressions that had fooled their initial scans and discovered the scaffolding of lies I had built over months of deception. I thought about the Venerable One standing in the reclusium, believing I had saved him from being cast aside, not knowing that I had actually confirmed every fear the Techmarines held about his degrading condition. And I thought about Brother Hadrian, the real one, dead for 6,000 years, his actual identity and deeds lost to time, while I had created a fictional version to comfort a failing mind. The examination began the following day. They took me to a chamber deep in the librarium's heart, a circular room with walls covered in warding symbols and psychic dampeners, technology and ritual working together to create a space where minds could be laid bare without interference. They strapped me into a throne-like chair that adjusted to grip my limbs and torso, preventing any movement that might disrupt the procedure. And one of the librarians, a younger one, I thought, though it was impossible to judge the age of the transhuman warriors, placed his armored hands on either side of my head. "This will be uncomfortable," he said, his voice flat and clinical. "You will experience memories as if living them directly. Do not resist the process. Resistance will only prolong the procedure and increase the risk of permanent damage." Then he pushed into my mind, and I learned what it meant to have your consciousness invaded by something that was never meant to touch mortal thoughts. It felt like drowning in fire, like having your skull opened and your brain exposed to scalding light, like every thought and memory simultaneously pulled to the surface and examined with instruments that were never designed for human neurology. The librarian moved through my recollections with the methodical thoroughness of an inquisitor searching a suspected heretic's archives, following threads of memory back to their origins, comparing my conscious recollections with the deeper patterns in my mind, and he found the lies. Of course he did. He found every fabrication I had created, every false memory I had constructed to maintain the deception, every detail I had invented to comfort the Venerable One's failing consciousness. But he found something else as well, something that made him withdraw from my mind with a suddenness that was almost physical, leaving me gasping in the chair while he turned to his brother librarians with an expression that might have been alarm. "The memories are propagating," he said, his voice tight with implications I didn't understand. "The false recollections are taking root in his psyche, developing the same resonance patterns as genuine experience. It's not simple deception. The act of constructing and repeatedly recounting these fabrications has caused them to become integrated with his authentic memories. He's not lying about believing them. He's developing dual consciousness, carrying both his true identity and the fictional persona he created to maintain the deception." They discussed this in technical terms while I sat trapped in the chair, trying to understand what they were saying. Something about memory formation and reinforcement, about the way human consciousness constructs narrative identity through repeated rehearsal of past events, about how thoroughly enough recounted false memory could achieve the same neurological status as actual experience. They spoke about it as if it were a fascinating phenomenon, a curious side effect of my months of deception, but I was beginning to understand the horrifying reality they were describing. I was becoming Brother Hadrian, The identity I had stolen and elaborated was taking root in my mind, developing its own history and continuity separate from my actual experiences. When I thought about the siege of Varanthos Prime, I could feel two sets of memories: my knowledge that I had invented the story, and the vivid impression of actually having been there, of having felt the heat of refracted weapons fire and the weight of armor that I had never worn. The boundary between Merrick the serf and Hadrian the space marine was blurring. Two identities, trying to occupy a single consciousness that was never meant to contain such contradiction. The examination continued for days, the librarians returning again and again to push into my mind and observe this strange phenomenon they had discovered. They treated me like a subject of study rather than a person, discussing my condition with the same detached interest a biologist might show toward an interesting mutation or parasitic infection. They documented every instance of dual memory they could find, mapping the growing network of false recollections that was spreading through my psyche like a cancer of identity. And then they brought the Inquisition. I never learned exactly how the Inquisitor became involved in what should have been an internal chapter matter, but I suppose the implications were obvious enough. If a mortal serf could develop false memories that psychic examination registered as authentic through simple repetition and elaboration, what might that mean for the reliability of testimony throughout the Imperium? How many confessions extracted under questioning might be similarly confused? Witnesses convinced they had seen things they had only imagined or suggested. How many historical accounts might be corrupted by the simple act of retelling until the teller could no longer distinguish memory from fiction? The Inquisitor was a thin woman with silver augmetic eyes and a voice like grinding glass. She reviewed the librarian's findings with cold efficiency, then ordered additional testing to determine the extent to which the process could be replicated or reversed. They tried everything: psychic interrogation, chemical treatments, even experimental neural recalibration, using technologies that left me screaming in the chair while they remapped the circuits of my consciousness. Nothing worked. The false memories had achieved too much integration with my authentic recollections. Brother Hadrian's identity had become a permanent resident in my mind, a second self that existed alongside my own identity without displacing it entirely. Contaminated, the Inquisitor finally declared. The subject represents a novel form of mimetic corruption, not heretical in origin, but demonstrating principles that could be exploited for purposes of psychological warfare or infiltration. The Space Marine chapter has been instructed to never again deploy the affected Dreadnought. The subject himself cannot be safely released, as his condition might prove contagious to others through repeated interaction. However, execution seems excessive given the potential research value. So they brought me here, to this orbital station where the Inquisition maintains facilities for the study of unusual phenomena that are neither clearly heretical nor clearly safe. My cell is small but not uncomfortable. They treat me reasonably well, understanding that subject cooperation improves research outcomes. Every few weeks they bring me to an examination chamber, and new inquisitorial agents, or their psycho specialists, push into my mind to study the dual consciousness I have developed, documenting how the false identity grows and evolves despite my isolation from any further exposure to the Venerable One or his stories. Because Brother Hadrian is still there, still developing, actually, growing more detailed and complex with each passing year despite having no new external input. My mind seems to be continuing the process I started, automatically filling in gaps in his fabricated history, inventing new campaigns and battle brothers to populate the lifetime I created for him. Sometimes I wake from dreams of battles I never fought, worlds I never walked, finding it takes longer each time to remember which memories are real and which are the products of this infection of identity I have inflicted upon myself. They let me write, understanding that recording these observations serves their research purposes. I maintain journals detailing the progression of my condition, noting when new false memories surface and how they integrate with existing recollections. The inquisitorial researchers review these documents with the same clinical interest they bring to all their examinations, mining them for insights into memory formation and the nature of human consciousness. I have become a living experiment in how thoroughly a person can be duplicated through narrative alone, how completely an identity can be stolen and internalized through the simple act of repetition. Sometimes I try to remember who I was before all this began. Merrick the Serf, born in the depths of the Hive City, selected at age 8 for service to the chapter, trained in the proper rites of maintenance and devotion, assigned to the reclusium at 19. Those memories feel thin now, faded like parchment left too long in the light, lacking the vivid sensory details that characterize the false recollections I created. It's as if by inventing such a rich history for Brother Hadrian, I drained substance from my own authentic past, used up all the available detail and immediacy in service to the fabrication, and the Venerable One? I was never told his ultimate fate, whether the Tech Marines finally placed him in stasis despite my testimony, whether he continues to stand in his alcove in the reclusium believing that his old battle brother confirmed his memories, whether he has deteriorated further or found some stability in the fiction I helped him construct, I do not know. The Inquisitor refused to answer my questions about him, saying that such knowledge was beyond my need or authority. I am permitted to know only what serves the research they conduct upon me, nothing more. But I think about him often, during the long hours when I'm left alone in my cell, with nothing but the dual consciousness he helped create. I wonder if he dreams, if the suspended animation they eventually must have imposed upon him produces any kind of experience, or if he exists in some timeless void, where past and present cease to have meaning. I wonder if he still believes Brother Hadrian lives, if that comfort survives the silence that must have followed my disappearance from his service. And I wonder, with a horror that grows sharper rather than duller with time, whether I did him any mercy at all with my deception, or whether I simply confirmed his worst fears that memory itself is unreliable, that the past dissolves into fiction given sufficient time, that even the most vivid recollections might be nothing more than stories we tell ourselves to pretend there was meaning in all the suffering. The station's day-night cycle is simulated through the lighting systems, an entirely arbitrary rhythm that bears no relationship to any actual planetary rotation. The researchers have discovered that maintaining me in such temporal isolation accelerates the progression of the dual consciousness, my mind's sense of continuity becoming further degraded when stripped of external anchoring in consistent solar cycles. So they keep me here in this small metal box tumbling through the void, where the only way to track the passage of time is by counting the examinations they perform and the meals they deliver through the cell's small aperture. I have been here 17 years, or perhaps it's 20. The memories grow confused when I try to count backward from the present moment. Was it 17 years since I first heard the Venerable One call me Hadrian? Or was that actually part of some previous iteration of consciousness that Brother Hadrian experienced during his service? Did I really grow up in a hive city? Or is that a false memory implanted by the inquisitorial researchers to provide baseline data for comparison with the fabricated recollections? How much of what I think I remember is authentic experience? And how much is simply story I have repeated to myself so many times it achieved the solidity of fact? The researchers say this uncertainty is itself valuable data. They document the progressive dissolution of my ability to distinguish between authentic and false memory, measuring the rate at which the fabricated identity propagates through my consciousness. One of them, a junior inquisitorial agent who seems to regard me with something approaching sympathy, told me that my case has contributed to 3 separate research papers on the nature of identity and the unreliability of human recollection. I have become a footnote in inquisitorial studies, an illustration of why testimony must always be verified through multiple sources and cannot be trusted to remain stable even in the minds of those who provide it. Sometimes I hate the Venerable One for what his confusion has done to me. I hate him for calling me Hadrian that first day, for setting in motion the deception that has devoured my identity piece by piece over the years. I hate him for the need in his voice when he asked me to testify, for making me complicit in his delusion through the simple act of wanting to be believed. And I hate him for being right in a way for understanding better than the tech marines, that memory is always partly fiction, that consciousness constructs rather than records, that the past exists only as story we tell ourselves about who we used to be. But mostly I pity him, because at least my imprisonment is visible, a cell with walls and guards that I can recognize as constraint. His prison was invisible, the sarcophagus that preserved his ruined body, while trapping his consciousness in isolation. The centuries of service that ground away everything except the need to remember who he had been, the slow degradation that made even his most certain recollections suspect and unreliable. He suffered for millennia in service to a chapter and an Imperium that would eventually decide he had become too broken to be useful, and his only crime was surviving long enough for time itself to become his enemy. I write this knowing it will be read by researchers who care nothing for the person writing it, who see me only as Subject 17 in study of mimetic identity corruption. I write it knowing that the words themselves may be part of the process, that recording these thoughts and memories may actually accelerate the dissolution of my authentic identity by forcing me to construct narrative where simple experience would otherwise exist. But I write it anyway, because the alternative is silence, and silence would mean surrendering entirely to the dual consciousness that divides my mind between who I was and who I pretended to be. My name is Merrick. I was a serf in the chapter's fortress monastery. I was assigned to maintain a dreadnought who confused me with a battle brother dead for 6 millennia, and I lied to him, told him I remembered things that never happened, and in doing so infected myself with an identity that is slowly devouring the authentic person I once was. My name is Hadrian. I served with the Venerable One during the chapter's founding campaigns. I fought beside him on Varanthos Prime and Gorol and 100 other worlds whose names have been lost to time and failing archives. And I died, truly died, thousands of years before a serf named Merrick was born. But somehow I have returned, a ghost constructed from lies and repetition, until the fabrication achieved sufficient density to become real. Both of these things are true. Both of these things are false. And I no longer possess the ability to determine which is which, or whether such determination is even meaningful when memory itself has become unreliable. When identity is revealed as nothing more than story, we repeat until we forget it began as invention. The researchers tell me that the dual consciousness will likely continue to develop until some threshold is reached where one identity or the other achieves dominance. They speculate about which will win, whether Merrick the serf will eventually reassert primacy and the false Hadrian will fade back into obvious fiction, or whether the elaborate fabrication will complete its takeover and the authentic identity will become the memories that feel unreal and distant. They have placed bets among themselves, casual wagers about the outcome of my consciousness's slow deterioration, and they document their predictions in the margins of their research notes. I think they are wrong. I don't believe either identity will triumph. Instead, I think they will continue to blur together, mixing and merging until what remains is neither Merrick nor Hadrian but something that is fundamentally both and neither, a consciousness that exists in the permanent state of uncertainty, unable to trust any memory or experience, forever divided between competing versions of a past that can never be definitively established as real. And perhaps that makes me the perfect citizen of the Imperium, in the end. Because what is the Imperium itself but a vast machine for the production and enforcement of collective fiction? The God Emperor on his golden throne, 10,000 years of service, the endless war against the enemies, without, and within all of it, is story, narrative constructed and repeated until it achieves the solidity of fact, until questioning it becomes impossible, because the alternative would be confronting the void where certainty once stood. We are all Brother Hadrian, all caught between the memory of what we were and the identity we have been told to embody, and the fact that the latter is obviously false changes nothing about its power over us. The station's lights have dimmed to simulate night cycle. In my cell I can hear the soft hum of the environmental systems, the distant clank of machinery, the occasional footstep of guards patrolling the corridors beyond my door. These sounds are real, I think. They must be real. But then again, I thought Varanthos Prime was real when I described its crystal walls to the tech marines, thought I could feel the heat of refracted weapons fire, and smell the ozone of energy discharges from a battle I had never witnessed. If I could be so thoroughly convinced by my own fabrications then, how can I trust that anything I experience now is authentic, rather than simply another layer of false memory accumulating in my deteriorating consciousness? I close my eyes, though whether I am Merrick trying to sleep or Hadrian reflecting on millennia of service, I can no longer say with any confidence. The dual identity cycles through my thoughts like a prayer whose meaning has been lost through too frequent repetition, words that continue to be spoken long after everyone has forgotten what they were supposed to accomplish. And I think about the Venerable One, standing in his alcove in the Reclusium, calling out into the darkness for a brother who has been dead for 6,000 years, his voice growing fainter as his power systems wind down toward whatever cold silence awaits warriors who have served too long. What happens when a dreadnought misremembers you? This is what happens. You become the thing it mistakes you for, your authentic identity dissolving into the reflection of its fractured consciousness until you can no longer distinguish between who you were and who it needed you to be. You lose yourself in the act of confirming someone else's delusions, and discover too late that there is no way back to the certainty you once possessed about the reality of your own existence. And somewhere in the fortress monastery I will never see again, the Venerable One dreams in his sarcophagus of battles we never fought together, of brotherhood that never existed, of memories that are lies made real through the simple act of wanting them to be true. He dreams, and I remember his dreams, and which of us is the original, and which the copy becomes impossible to determine, because we have both been infected by the same disease, the understanding that consciousness is fiction, that identity is a story we tell ourselves, and that the only difference between truth and deception is whether we have repeated the lie often enough to forget it began as invention. My name is Merrick. My name is Hadrian. My name is a question that no longer has an answer that means anything, a designator for a consciousness that exists in the permanent state of division between competing versions of a past that can never be reconciled. And if the inquisitorial researchers are reading this, as I know they will be, I hope they understand that their Subject 17 is trying to tell them something important about the nature of the Imperium they serve and the consciousness they believe gives them authority to judge others as contaminated or corrupted. We are all misremembered. All of us are composites of fiction and fact, so thoroughly blended that extraction becomes impossible. The only difference between me and those who call themselves certain of their identity is that I have been forced to confront this reality directly, to live in full awareness of the dissolution that underlies all claims to authentic selfhood. And in that awareness lies a kind of terrible freedom, the understanding that if identity is fiction anyway, then there is no betrayal in choosing which story to believe, no deception in embracing the narrative that offers the most comfort, or meaning, or hope. The Venerable One knew this, I think. Knew it with the wisdom that comes from having existed long enough to watch your own memories become unreliable, to understand that consciousness maintains continuity through story, rather than through any direct access to the past as it actually occurred. And when he called me Hadrian, he was not truly confused or deluded. He was offering me a choice to remain Merrick the serf, insignificant and forgettable, or to become Brother Hadrian, warrior and witness, someone whose existence mattered enough to be remembered across millennia. I chose badly. Or perhaps I chose correctly, and the error lay in believing that such choosing was optional, that I could have refused the identity being offered without consequences equally devastating to my sense of self. Either way, I am here now, trapped in this cell where inquisitorial researchers study the ruins of my consciousness, and the Venerable One is there in his alcove if he exists at all anymore, and between us lies the gulf of deception and truth, and the fundamental unreliability of memory that makes distinguishing between them impossible. The lights have dimmed further. Soon the researchers will come with their instruments and their questions, and I will submit to another examination of the dual identity that divides my mind. And I will answer their questions as honestly as I can, Though honesty itself has become a concept without clear meaning, when the consciousness doing the answering cannot reliably determine which memories are authentic and which are elaborate fabrication. And perhaps that is the final lesson of all this, that honesty is not about access to objective truth, but about the sincere effort to describe consciousness as it is experienced, even when that experience reveals the absence of any stable ground beneath our claims to know anything at all. What happens when a dreadnought misremembers you? You discover that memory itself is a kind of misremembering, that consciousness is fiction all the way down, and that the only thing separating the authentic from the fabricated is our collective agreement to pretend that the distinction matters and that we can reliably make it. And you live with that knowledge, if you can call this living, while the two versions of yourself that should never have occupied the same mind slowly blur together into something that is neither who you were nor who you pretended to be, but some third thing that exists only in the permanent state of uncertainty about its own reality. My name is Merrick. My name is Hadrian. My name is Subject 17. And all of these are true, and all of these are false, and there is no longer any meaningful way to determine which is which, if there ever was. The Venerable One understood this, and in calling me by another's name, he was not imposing delusion but revealing truth, that identity is always borrowed, always stolen from the stories we tell about who we used to be, and that the only question is whether we have the courage to admit we are all living in the confusion between memory and fabrication, or whether we will continue to insist on certainties that dissolve the moment they are examined too closely. I have 17 years until the next examination, or perhaps it's 20 minutes. Time itself has become unreliable in this cell where they keep me, another victim of the same process that has destroyed the boundaries of my identity, and I will wait here in the darkness, divided against myself, remembering battles I never fought and a life I never lived, while somewhere in the fortress monastery a dreadnought dreams of a brother who never existed except a story told often enough to become real. This is what happens. This is always what happens in the Imperium of man, where truth is whatever the administratum declares it to be, and memory is whatever the machine spirits record, and identity is whatever name they assign you in the databanks, regardless of whether you recognize yourself in that designation. We are all misremembered, all confused for something we are not, all required to embody identities that were invented for us and repeated until objection became impossible. And in the end, we become the thing they remember us as, or we cease to exist entirely. There is no third option, no escape from the grinding machinery of narrative that transforms individuals into functions, consciousness into story, and truth into whatever fiction has been repeated often enough to seem inevitable. My name is what they call me. My memories are what they say I remember, and the only freedom left to me is the choice to embrace the fiction or to resist it, knowing that resistance changes nothing except perhaps the speed with which the inevitable dissolution occurs. The Venerable One made his choice long ago, and I made mine when I agreed to be his witness. And now we are both trapped in the consequences, he in his alcove of silence, me in this cell of examination, and between us, the vast indifference of an Imperium that cares nothing for the consciousness of those who serve it, only that they continue to function in whatever capacity their conditioning has prepared them for. What happens when a dreadnought misremembers you? This happens. This is always what happens, and there is no escape, no redemption, no recovery of the certainty that once seemed to ground your sense of who you were. There is only the slow dissolution, the gradual blurring of boundaries that once seemed absolute, and the eventual understanding that identity itself was always fiction, memory was always unreliable, and consciousness was always a fragile story told in the darkness, hoping that repetition would be enough to make it real. My name was Merrick. My name is Hadrian. My name is whatever they decide to call what remains when the examination is complete and the researchers have extracted everything they need from the ruins of the person I once believed myself to be. And I will continue, if this can be called continuing, divided against myself, bearing witness to my own dissolution, until some final threshold is reached, where even the pretense of identity can no longer be maintained, and all that remains is the awareness that I was something once, though what exactly that something was has been lost to the same process of forgetting and fabrication that destroys everything in the end. The lights have failed completely now. Or perhaps I have simply closed my eyes. In the darkness, it becomes impossible to distinguish between the two, just as it has become impossible to distinguish between memory and invention, between Merrick and Hadrian, between the consciousness that observes these changes and the changes themselves. The Venerable One is silent, or perhaps he is speaking, has been speaking all along, and I simply lack the ability to hear him anymore across the distance that separates his alcove from my cell and his consciousness from what remains of my own. And in that silence, in that absence of certainty about anything at all, I find something that might be peace, or might be simple exhaustion, the understanding that resistance was always pointless because there was nothing solid to resist, no authentic identity to defend against corruption, because identity itself was always already corrupted, always already fictional, always already dissolving into the void where all stories eventually go when they have been repeated too many times to maintain their power. What happens when a dreadnought misremembers you? You learn that you were always misremembered, even by yourself. And that knowledge, that terrible knowledge, is the only thing that remains when everything else has been stripped away.